Welcome to the world of sci-fi stories, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel. Enjoy the listening. The sky of Zira shimmered like a living canvas, its twin suns casting iridescent hues across the horizon, their lights scattered against crystalline spires that rose like natural monuments, refracting soft rainbows onto the land below. The air, tinged with the scent of alien flora, felt dense yet strangely energizing. Nathaniel Carter stood at the edge of a vast crystalline valley, his boots pressing into moss terrain that pulsed faintly underfoot, as if the planet itself was alive. Nathaniel Nate, to the few who knew him well, adjusted the controls on his wrist device, his voice calm and clinical as it recorded his observations. Planet Zira surface conditions, stable ecosystem complexity, exceeds initial projections. Bioluminescent flora, suggests adaptations for low-light survival. Further study required. He lowered his arm and scanned the expanse ahead. The Xian village was nestled in the valley below, its structures flowing seamlessly from the crystalline terrain. The architecture seemed organic, as if the buildings had grown rather than been constructed. Pulsing veins of light coursed through their surfaces, casting a rhythmic glow that matched the faint hum in the air. Everything on this planet seemed interconnected, alive. The village stirred with movement. Translucent skinned figures emerged from the crystalline structures, their elongated limbs moving gracefully, almost fluidly. The Xian, known for their serene demeanor, regarded him in silence, their eyes shimmering with soft violet hues, revealed a quiet intensity as they observed the human intruder. One figure stepped forward. He was taller than the others, his translucent skin glowing faintly with golden veins that seemed to pulse with purpose. Draped in flowing robes that shifted in color like liquid metal, he carried an aura of authority that was impossible to ignore. This was Kay, the village elder and the spiritual guide of the Tsiran people. You are the human explorer, Kay said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a cadence that suggested he was unused to speaking directly. Welcome to Zira. Your presence here will be judged by your actions. Nate straightened, keeping his tone measured. Thank you for allowing me to visit. I'm here as a researcher to study and observe. No disruption, no interference. Kay's eyes narrowed slightly, his amber gaze unyielding. All who come to Zira claim such things. Few understand the meaning of those words. The elder gestured toward the village, and the other Xian began dispersing, their movements silent but deliberate as they melted back into their crystalline dwellings. One figure lingered, watching Nate with a gaze that burned hotter than the twin suns. She stepped forward, her presence cutting through the air like a sudden gust of wind. Her translucent skin glowed faintly blue, her veins pulsing with a light that felt almost hypnotic. Her face was sharp yet ethereal, her features accented by a crown of braided tendrils that shimmered like spun glass. She wore no adornments, unlike the others. Her simplicity only amplified her otherworldly beauty. Her eyes, deep pools of shifting violet and indigo, locked onto Nate with such intensity that he instinctively stepped back. She studied him, her gaze as sharp as a blade slicing through the haze of his thoughts. Do you remember me, human? Her voice was soft yet piercing, carrying the weight of an accusation and the ache of an old wound. Nate blinked, startled. The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. He searched her face for some clue, some flicker of recognition, but found none. I think you have me confused with someone else. We've never met. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the faint glow of her veins shifted, dimming slightly as though disappointment coursed through her. You do not remember, she said, her tone flat, but her eyes betrayed a deep hurt. But I remember you around them. The village fell eerily silent. The Zirans, who had appeared to disperse, now lingered in the shadows, their gazes fixed on the confrontation. Nate's unease deepened. He glanced at Kaith, searching for some explanation, but the elder merely watched with an expression as unreadable as the shifting aurora in the sky. I'm sorry, Nate said, his voice firmer, now trying to regain control of the situation. I don't know you, whatever this is. I think there's been a mistake. Her violet eyes darkened to near black, the transformation unnerving. Mistakes do not erase truth, human, she said. You have forgotten, but forgetting does not absolve you. Before Nate could respond, Kay stepped forward, his towering form cutting between them. Lion, he said gently, but firmly the human has only just arrived, let him breathe the air before. We demand answers. Len hesitated, her glowing veins flickering erratically. Before she stepped back without another word, she turned and walked away, her movements fluid like a river retreating. From the shore, the light around her seemed to dim as she vanished into one of the crystalline structures. Nate let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Kate. Who is she? The elder's gaze lingered on the place where Lion had disappeared before returning to Nate. Lion, he said simply, a seeker of truths. Her ways are not always gentle, but her intent is pure. Nate frowned. She's convinced. She knows me, that something happened between us. I've never been here before. C tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Memory is sacred to us, but it flows like water. It can erode or be reshaped perhaps. Lan knows something you do not. The words unsettled Nate. He had come to Zur to escape his past, not to confront a mystery tied to it. He nodded curtly. I appreciate the explanation, but I'm here to study, not get caught up in whatever this is. C smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Study all you wish, human, but tread carefully. What is forgotten is not always forgiven. Nate didn't respond. He followed C into the village, the crystalline buildings humming faintly as they passed. The elder pointed out key location, a communal center, the meditation grounds, the researchers' quarters. Nate took in the details, but his thoughts lingered on Lion. Who was she, and why had she spoken to him? As if they shared a history. That night Nate lay in the small quarters assigned to him, staring at the shifting patterns of light on the ceiling. The twin moons of Zura hung high in the sky, casting silver blue light across the room. He closed his eyes, but the image of Lyra's face lingered, her words echoing in his mind. His dreams came in flashes, a crystalline valley bathed in blue light, a pair of glowing hands reaching toward him, laughter faint but hauntingly familiar. He woke with a start, his heart racing. Outside his window, a shadow moved. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw her, Lyra, her glowing blue figure framed by the alien landscape. She stood silently watching him before fading into the night like a whisper carried away by the wind. Nate clenched his fists. He had come to Zura to leave his past behind. Instead, he felt it closing and wrapping around him in a way he couldn't escape. Whatever Lyra believed, whatever truths this planet held, he knew one thing: forgetting would no longer be an option. The suns of Zura hung low in the sky, their light refracting through the crystalline structures of the village, bathing everything in a soft golden glow. Nate stood outside his quarters, squinting at the alien horizon. His thoughts knotted in confusion. Sleep had eluded him the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, fractured images assailed him, glowing hands reaching for him, laughter like music echoing in his mind, and Lion's piercing gaze holding him captive. He rubbed his temples, trying to piece together the fragments, but they slipped away like sand through his fingers. The village was alive with quiet motion. Siron figures moved gracefully among their glowing structures, their translucent forms catching and refracting light as if they were living prisms. Yet despite their serenity, Nate couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The weight of their collective gazes pressed on him, a silent judgment he couldn't escape. Nathani. The voice was soft but commanding. He turned sharply to find Len standing behind him. Her glowing blue skin seemed to pulse faintly, her presence magnetic and unyielding. She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping closer until the space between them was taut with tension. We need to talk, she said, her tone devoid of pretense. Now Nate tensed. He had hoped to avoid her, to bury himself in his research and ignore the strange pull she seemed to have over him. But there was no escaping her intensity. Fine, he said, keeping his voice neutral. Say what you need to say. Not here. She gestured toward the edge of the village, where the crystalline forest loomed. Come with me. Nate hesitated, glancing at the villagers. Their luminous eyes followed them, their expressions unreadable. He felt exposed, as if agreeing to her request would tether him to something he wasn't ready to face. But Lion's gaze didn't waver, and despite his better judgment, he found himself nodding. The forest hummed as they entered its bioluminescent plants, swaying gently as though alive to their presence. The ground beneath them glowed faintly with each step, creating ripples of light that spread outward in delicate patterns. The air felt heavier here, charged with an energy that made Nate's skin prickle. You've been avoiding me, Lion, said her voice cutting through the stillness. I've been trying to make sense of what's happening, Nate replied. You show up out of nowhere, claim we've met before. And he hesitated, his throat tightening. And you tell me you're carrying my child. How am I supposed to process that? She stopped abruptly and turned to face him. Her violet eyes darkened, their shifting hue and unsettling reflection of her emotions. You're supposed to face it, Nathaniel. Instead, you've buried it, just as you buried everything else. He frowned, the sharp edge of her words igniting a defensive spark in him. I don't bury things. If I don't remember, it's because it didn't happen. No, her voice softened, but the steel in her tone remained. You don't remember because you chose not to. This planet, this place, it doesn't allow lies, not even the ones you tell yourself. Memory here is fluid, malleable, but it isn't. Never gone. What you've forgotten you can reclaim if you're brave enough. Nate scoffed, crossing his arms. Brave enough? You're making it sound like I ran away from some kind of truth I've never been here before. Lion, how could I forget something that never happened? Her expression softened, though her gaze remained piercing. You have been here, Nathaniel, not in body, but in spirit. When you arrived on Zirai, you brought with you all the pain, all the fear. You've been running from this planet's energy, reached into that darkness, and in it you found me. For a moment you let yourself be vulnerable, you let yourself feel, and then you pushed it away. Her words struck a nerve he hadn't realized was raw. He shook his head, taking a step back. You're talking in riddles. Spirit, energy, vulnerability. It doesn't make sense, doesn't it? She countered, stepping closer. When you arrived, you felt it, didn't you? That pull, that sense of déjà vu you couldn't explain. You've been dreaming of me, haven't you? His stomach churned. He thought of the fragmented images that haunted him, the glowing valley, and the laughter that felt so achingly familiar. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. Dreams don't prove anything. Lion's gaze softened, her voice lowering. Do you even know why you came here, Nathaniel? What you were running from? The question froze him. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She saw the hesitation, the crack in his armor, and pressed on. You came here because you were drowning, she said, in guilt, in grief, in fear. You thought this mission, this planet, would give you distance, a chance to escape. But Zara doesn't let you escape. It forces you to confront what you've hidden, even from yourself. Nate's chest tightened. He thought of Earth, of the life he had left behind. A flash of memory surfaced. Seed, an accident, the sharp sound of shattering glass, the sight of someone's hand slipping from his grasp. He pushed it down, burying it deep. You don't know me, he said, his voice trembling with frustration. You don't know what I've been through. I know enough, she replied. I know that the man who shared that night with me, the man who allowed himself to feel, is buried beneath all that pain, and I know that he's still here, whether you want to admit it or not. Nate felt the weight of her words press down on him, heavy and suffocating. He wanted to argue, to deny her claims, but something inside him cracked. The dreams, the sense of familiarity, the pull, he couldn't explain it, all pointed to a truth he wasn't ready to face. Lion stepped closer, her expression soft but unyielding. I am not here to accuse you, Nathaniel. I am here because you deserve to know the truth, even if you've tried to forget it. What we shared wasn't a mistake, and what's growing inside me is proof of that. His breath hitched, his mind racing. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that none of this was possible, but the certainty in her eyes, the conviction in her voice, made it impossible to dismiss her. Deep down, he knew there was more to her words than he wanted to admit. Before he could respond, the forest around them seemed to shift. The hum of the plants grew erratic, their light dimming as a ripple moved through the air. Len's glow flickered, her gaze snapping toward the disturbance. What's happening? Nate asked, his voice low. We're not alone, she said, her tone grim. A shadow emerged from the trees, its form sharp and angular, its veins glowing a hostile red. It stepped closer, its movements predatory, its eyes fixed on Nate. The air grew colder, and the weight of its presence pressed down on him like a physical force. Len stepped in front of him, her glow intensifying. He's under my protection. You will not harm him, the figure hissed, a sound that sent a shiver down Nate's spine. It took another step forward, and Lion raised her hand, a wave of blue light emanating from her palm. The figure paused, its red glow flickering, but it didn't retreat. Go back to the village, Len said, her voice sharp. I'm not leaving you here, Nate said, his fists clenching. You have no choice, she snapped, her eyes flashing with urgency. If they take you, everything we've worked for will be lost. Go. He hesitated, his instincts wearing with his sense of self-preservation, But the sight of the hostile figure advancing made the decision for him. He turned and ran, the glowing forest blurting around him as his pulse thundered in his ears. When he reached the edge of the village, he stopped and turned back. The forest was silent, the disturbance gone, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing: the past he had tried so hard to forget was no longer willing to stay buried. The crystalline valley stretched before them like a living dream. Light danced across jagged, translucent spires that rose from the earth, refracting the twin sun's rays into a kaleidoscope of color. Each step Nate took sent ripples of luminescent energy through the mossy terrain beneath his boots. The air here hummed with an almost tangible vitality, pressing against his skin and filling his lungs with an intoxicating sharpness. Lion walked ahead, her movements fluid and purposeful, her glowing blue skin pulsed faintly with each step, her presence as otherworldly as the landscape around them. Nate followed in silence, his thoughts a storm of questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. He had no idea where she was taking him or what he was meant to find here, but something about her resolve kept him moving forward. "This is where it happened," Lion said suddenly, her voice breaking the heavy quiet. Nate stopped, scanning the area. The valley was beautiful, yes, but it was also alien. There was nothing familiar about it. "Where what happened?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. She turned to face him, her violet eyes piercing. "Where we first connected, where you let yourself be seen." "I've told you," Nate said, exasperation creeping into his voice. "I don't remember any of this. If I'd been here before, don't you think I'd know you were here?" she said firmly. "You let yourself forget," because the truth was too heavy to carry. Nate sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And what truth is that exactly?" Lion gestured to the towering spires around them. This valley is more than just a landscape. It's alive, Nathaniel. It holds memories, feelings, fragments of those who step into it. When you were here before, the energy of this place amplified what you were carrying, what you were trying to escape. It pulled you into yourself, made you face it, and in doing so you found me." Her words sent a shiver down his spine. He shook his head, refusing to let himself be swept up in the mysticism. She seemed to embody this. Is starting to sound like something out of a bad science fiction novel. Len tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You always did deflect when you were uncomfortable." Before he could respond, she stepped closer to one of the spires, placing her hand on its smooth, glowing surface. She closed her eyes. The spire began to vibrate softly, emitting a low hum that resonated through the valley. Light rippled outward, flowing from one spire to the next until the entire landscape pulsed with energy. Nate staggered back as the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The air thickened, and a strange warmth spread through his chest. He felt something stir inside him, a sensation he couldn't place, like the ghost of a memory trying to resurface. "What is this?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Len didn't answer immediately. She turned to him, her eyes glowing with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "This valley holds echoes of the past. Touch the spire, and it will show you what you've tried to forget." Nate hesitated, his hand hovering over the smooth surface of the nearest spire. Every instinct told him to turn back, to walk away before he unearthed something he couldn't handle, but something in Len's gaze held him there, a silent challenge that he couldn't ignore. Slowly he placed his hand on the spire. The effect was immediate. A wave of energy surged through him, and the world around him dissolved. He was no longer standing in the valley. Instead, he was surrounded by blinding blue light, his body weightless as images began to form in the air around him. He saw himself standing in this very valley. His expression was raw, unguarded in a way he didn't recognize. Leon stood before him, her glowing form bathed in the valley's light. They were speaking, though the words were muffled, their meaning lost in the haze of memory, but the emotions were clear: connection, longing, fear. He could feel them as if they were his own. The vision shifted. He saw himself reaching out to her, his hand trembling as it met hers. The light around them intensified, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It was just the two of them, suspended in the energy of the valley, bound by something neither of them seemed to fully understand. And then the memory darkened. He saw himself pulling away, his face contorted with anguish. He was speaking again, but this time the words were clear. "I can't do this," his P.S. said. "I can't." The vision shattered, and Nate was thrown back into the present. He stumbled, his breath ragged, as he tried to process what he had seen. His hands trembled, and his chest ached with an unfamiliar weight. Watched him, her expression unreadable. "Now do you see?" she asked. Softly. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would I leave? Why would I forget something like that?" "Because you were afraid," she said. "Simply, you felt something you couldn't control, something that terrified you. Instead of facing it, you chose to bury it. But memories don't die, Nathaniel. They linger, waiting for the right moment to resurface." He sank to the ground, his head in his hands. The vision had felt so real, so visceral, but it didn't make sense. He wasn't the kind of person who ran away from things, or at least he didn't think he was. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice cracking. Len knelt beside him, her presence grounding. "It's not about fixing anything, it's about remembering, accepting. The valley showed you the truth, because you're ready to face it now. But there's more, Nathaniel. The night we shared was just the beginning." He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for answers. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her glow dimming slightly. "There's a reason I sought you out, why I couldn't let you leave without understanding what we shared here. It created something new, something that's never existed before." Her hand drifted to her abdomen, and the weight of her words settled over him like a physical force. He stared at her, his mind racing to comprehend what she was saying. "You mean?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "The child I carry is part of you, part of us, and its existence changes everything." The air around them seemed to grow heavier, the valley hum intensifying. Nate felt the ground shift beneath him, the enormity of her words threatening to pull him under. He didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear: the past he had tried so hard to forget was no longer willing to stay buried. The crystalline valleys stretched before them like a living dream. Light danced across jagged, translucent spires that rose from the earth, refracting the twin sun's rays into a kaleidoscope of color. Each step Nate took sent ripples of luminescent energy through the mossy terrain beneath his boots. The air here hummed with an almost tangible vitality, pressing against his skin and filling his lungs with an intoxicating sharpness. Len walked ahead, her movements fluid and purposeful, her glowing blue skin pulsed faintly with each step, her presence as otherworldly as the landscape around them. Nate followed in silence, his thoughts a storm of questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. He had no idea where she was taking him or what he was meant to find here, but something about her resolve kept him moving forward. "This is where it happened," Lion said suddenly, her voice breaking the heavy quiet. Nate stopped, scanning the area. The valley was beautiful, yes, but it was also alien. There was nothing familiar about it. "Where what happened?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. She turned to face him, her violet eyes piercing. "Where we first connected, where you let yourself be seen." "I've told you," Nate said, exasperation creeping into his voice. "I don't remember any of this. If I'd been here before, don't you think I'd know you were here?" she said firmly. "You let yourself forget because the truth was too heavy to carry." Nate sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And what truth is that exactly?" Len gestured to the towering spires around them. "This place is vast, more than just a landscape. It's alive, Nathaniel. It holds memories, feelings, fragments of those who step into it. When you were here before, the energy of this place amplified what you were carrying, what you were trying to escape. It pulled you into yourself, made you face it, and in doing so you found me." Her words sent a shiver down his spine. He shook his head, refusing to let himself be swept up in the mysticism. She seemed to embody this. "Is starting to sound like something out of a bad science fiction novel." Lion tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You always did deflect when you were uncomfortable." Before he could respond, she stepped closer to one of the spires, placing her hand on its smooth, glowing surface. She closed her eyes. The spire began to vibrate softly, emitting a low hum that resonated through the valley. Light rippled outward, flowing from one spire to the next until the entire landscape pulsed with energy. Nate staggered back as the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The air thickened, and a strange warmth spread through his chest. He felt something stir inside him, a sensation he couldn't place, like the ghost of a memory trying to resurface. "What is this?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Lion didn't answer immediately. She turned to him, her eyes glowing with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. This valley holds echoes of the past. Touch the spire, and it will show you what you've tried to forget. Nate hesitated, his hand hovering over the smooth surface of the nearest spire. Every instinct told him to turn back, to walk away before he unearthed something he couldn't handle, but something in Len's gaze held him there, a silent challenge that he couldn't ignore. Slowly, he placed his hand on the spire. The effect was immediate. A wave of energy surged through him, and the world around him dissolved. He was no longer standing in the valley. Instead, he was surrounded by blinding blue light, his body weightless as images began to form in the air around him. He saw himself standing in this very valley. His expression was raw, unguarded in a way he didn't recognize. Lion stood before him, her glowing form bathed in the valley's light. They were speaking, though the words were muffled, their meaning lost in the haze of memory. But the emotions were clear: connection, longing, fear. He could feel them, as if they were his own. The vision shifted. He saw himself reaching out to her, his hand trembling as it met hers. The light around them intensified, and for a moment everything else faded away. It was just the two of them, suspended in the energy of the valley, bound by something neither of them seemed to fully understand. And then the memory darkened. He saw himself pulling away, his face contorted with anguish. He was speaking again, but this time the words were clear. "I can't do this," his past self said. "I can't." The vision shattered, and Nate was thrown back into the present. He stumbled, his breath ragged as he tried to process what he had seen. His hands trembled, and his chest ached with an unfamiliar weight. Len watched him, her expression unreadable. "Now, do you see?" she asked softly. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would I leave? Why would I forget something like that?" "Because you were afraid," she said. "Simply, you felt something you couldn't control. Something that terrified you. Instead of facing it, you chose to bury it. But memories don't die, Nathaniel. They linger, waiting for the right moment to resurface." He sank to the ground, his head in his hands. The vision had felt so real, so visceral, but it didn't make sense. He wasn't the kind of person who ran away from things, or at least he didn't think he was. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice cracking. Len knelt beside him, her presence grounding. "It's not about fixing anything, it's about remembering, accepting. The valley showed you the truth because you're ready to face it now. But there's more, Nathaniel. The night we shared was just the beginning." He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for answers. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her glow dimming slightly. "There's a reason I sought you out, why I couldn't let you leave without understanding what we shared here. It created something new, something that's never existed before." Her hand drifted to her abdomen, and the weight of her words settled over him like a physical force. He stared at her, his mind racing to comprehend what she was saying. "You mean?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "The child I carry is part of you, the air inside the cavern was thick with anticipation, a silent hum vibrating through the crystalline walls like a heartbeat." Nate stood at the threshold, his chest tightened as he stared at the swirling mist of the veil of echoes. Its colors shifted hypnotically, blues and purples bleeding into golds and silvers, forming a living, breathing presence that seemed to beckon him forward. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his nerves. Every instinct told him to turn back, but the weight of unanswered questions pressed him forward. Behind him, C's voice broke the silence. "The veil holds no bias. It shows all that is hidden, your triumphs, your failures, your fears. Once you step inside, there is no turning back. Until it is finished with you." Nate glanced over his shoulder. The elder's glowing amber eyes were calm, unwavering, as though he had seen this moment unfold countless times before. Len, however, stood rigid, her usually serene expression clouded with worry. Her glowing blue veins pulsed erratically, betraying the storm beneath her composed exterior. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "The veil is not merciful. It doesn't just show you memories, it makes you live them, feel them." Nate met her gaze, searching for something, certainty perhaps, or an anchor to steady him. "I can't keep running," he said, his voice firm despite the knot in his stomach. "Whatever's inside me, whatever I buried, it's eating me alive. If this is the only way to understand, then I'll face it." Her expression tightened, her violet eyes darkening as she stepped closer. If it gets too overwhelming, focus on something real, your breath, your heartbeat. Remember that it's just a memory, not your reality anymore. Don't let it consume you. He nodded, her words grounding him as he turned back to the veil. The swirling mist seemed to stretch toward him, curious, eager to pull him in. With one last deep breath, he stepped forward, and the world fell away at first. There was only light, blinding, all-encompassing, and searingly beautiful. Then the light fragmented, breaking into shards that rearranged themselves into images. Nate blinked, trying to make sense of the scene that materialized around him. He was in the valley, but it was different. The light was brighter, the crystalline spires larger, their surfaces pulsing with energy. The hum of the planet was louder here, resonating deep in his chest. He saw himself standing in the middle of the valley, his posture tense, his expression raw with emotion. Lion stood before him, her blue glow bright against the shimmering landscape. They were speaking, but the words were muffled, distorted, like hearing through water. The vision sharpened, and suddenly he could hear them. "I don't know how to do this," his past self said, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to let this happen." "You don't have to know," Ren replied, her tone calm, but laced with urgency. "You just have to let go." The Nate in the memory hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Then slowly he reached out his hand, shaking as it met hers. The moment their fingers touched, the valley exploded with light. A wave of energy rippled outward, and Enovus and its existence changes. Everything, the air around them, seemed to grow heavier, the valley's hum intensifying. Nate felt the ground shift beneath him, the enormity of her words threatening to pull him under. He didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear: the past he had tried so hard to forget was no longer willing to stay buried. The atmosphere in the village was taut, like the charged air before a storm. The crystalline spires that usually shimmered with serene light now pulsed erratically, reflecting the unease of the Xiran people. Nate stood in the central square, the weight of recent revelations heavy on his shoulders. Around him, villagers whispered among themselves, their translucent forms casting elongated shadows under the twin sun. He sensed their anxiety, their uncertainty, and it mirrored his own. Approached, his golden aura subdued, but his eyes sharp. "We must talk," the elder said, his voice grave. Len stood beside Nate, her blue glow steady yet dimmer than usual. She exchanged a worried glance with C. "It's about the rogues, isn't it?" Ken nodded solemnly. "They grow restless. Your union has stirred old fears, awakened ancient prejudices." Nate frowned. "I don't understand. Why does our child threaten them so much?" Kai sighed, his gaze drifting toward the horizon, where the crystalline forest met the sky. "Centuries ago, a prophecy spoke of a child born of two worlds, one who could either unite us or bring about our downfall. Some believe your child fulfills this prophecy. They fear change, fear the unknown." Lion's eyes flashed with determination. "But the prophecy doesn't foretell doom. It speaks of potential, of a choice. Fear distorts perception." Kaith replied, "The rogue faction sees only the potential for ruin." Nate felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't expected. "So they're willing to harm an unborn child because of a prophecy?" Kay met his gaze. "They believe they are preserving our way of life. Misguided though they are resolute. Can't we reason with them?" Nate asked. "I've tried," said softly. "For weeks I've attempted to bridge the gap, to make them see the possibilities, but they are entrenched in their beliefs." A murmur rippled through the gathered villagers. One of them, a younger Xiran with emerald green veins, "Sit forward, Elder Ci. The scouts have returned. The rogues are mobilizing. They plan to attack at nightfall." Lenk's glow intensified. "Then we must prepare. We can't let them harm the village or the child." Kay raised a hand. "Violence is not our way. Neither is standing idle while we're threatened," she retorted. Nate placed a hand on her shoulder. "There might be another way." All eyes turned to him. He took a deep breath. "Let me talk to them." Len looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "You can't be serious. They want you dead." "Exactly," Nate replied. "Maybe if I confront them, show them I'm not a threat, they might reconsider." Kay considered this. "It's a noble offer, but dangerous. They may not listen. Then I'll make them listen," Nate said firmly. "I can't hide while others risk their lives because of me." As Dus approached, Nate ventured toward the outskirts of the village, accompanied by Kai and Lion. The sky was awash with hues of violet and crimson, the twin suns dipping below the Horizon the crystalline forest ahead loomed ominously, its usual luminescence. "Dulled, are you sure about this?" Lion asked quietly. "No," Nate admitted, "but it's worth a try." Handed him a slender staff etched with glowing symbols. "Take this, it will offer some protection." Nate accepted the staff, feeling its warmth pulse through his hand. "Thank you." From the shadows figures emerged, Xer, with veins glowing a stark red, their expressions hardened by conviction. The rogue leader stepped forward, taller than the rest, his eyes piercing so the human shows himself. Nate held his ground. "I've come to talk." "There's nothing to discuss," the leader sneered. "Your very existence disrupt the balance of our world. How can a child threaten an entire world?" Nate challenged, "especially one that could unite our people." "Unite?" the leader spat. "The word your kind brings destruction. We've seen it before." It's stepped aside. "Nate, those were different times. We have learned, evolved. Some lessons are etched in blood," the leader retorted. "We won't allow history to repeat itself." Len moved forward, her voice steady, but laden with emotion. "This child is a symbol of hope. You're letting fear dictate your actions." "Silence!" the leader barked. "You have betrayed your own." A murmur spread among the rogues. Nate sensed a fissure in their unity. He seized the moment. "If you fear the unknown, let me help you understand. I offer myself willingly. Judge me not, an innocent child." The leader's eyes narrowed. "You would sacrifice yourself if it means protecting those I care about?" "Yes," Nate said without hesitation. A rogue near the back stepped forward hesitantly. Her veins glowed a softer red. "Perhaps we should listen." "Silence, Cyrus!" the leader snapped. "No," she insisted, her gaze shifting between Nate and the leader. "We act out of fear, not wisdom. The elder has tried to reach us. Maybe we've been wrong." The leader's expression darkened. "You've been swayed by their lies, or maybe you've been blinded by your hatred." Sarah shot back. Tension crackled in the air. Nate gripped the staff tightly, ready for anything. The rogues exchanged uncertain glances, their once solid resolve wavering. Thith stepped forward, his golden glow brightening. "Let us end this cycle of fear together. We can forge a new path." For a moment it seemed the rogues might stand down, but the leader's face twisted with rage. "I will not allow our world to be tainted." He lunged at Nate, a blade of crimson energy materializing in his hand. Before Nate could react, Ceres intervened, blocking the attack with a swift motion. "Enough," she cried. "This isn't the way." The leader snarled. "Traitor!" Chaos erupted. Some rogues sided with the leader, while others hesitated or joined Ceres. The villagers, sensing the shift, moved to protect their own. The tranquil village transformed into a battlefield of light and shadow. Nate found himself dueling with one of the aggressors, their movements a blur. He parried strikes with the staff, each clash sending sparks of energy into the air. His earlier fear was replaced with a focused determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself, but for Len and their child. Lion battled nearby, her blade weaving arcs of blue light as she defended against two rogues. Sci-Fi moved with surprising agility for his age, using his staff to deflect attacks and disarm opponents without harming them. Amidst the turmoil, Nate caught sight of the leader breaking through the fray, heading straight for Len. "Len, behind you!" he shouted. She turned just in time to block the leader's strike, but the force knocked her off balance. The leader pressed the advantage, his attacks relentless. Nate's heart pounded. Without thinking, he rushed toward them. "Leave her alone," the leader sneered. "You cannot save her." Human. As the leader raised his blade for a final blow, Nate channeled all his strength and swung his staff. The impact struck the leader's arm, throwing off his aim. Len seized the moment, delivering a swift kick that sent the leader stumbling back. Enraged, the leader prepared to retaliate, but Kei intervened, his golden aura flaring brilliantly. "This ends now," the elder commanded, his voice resonating with authority. A shockwave emanated from Ci, rippling through the battlefield. The combatants froze, stunned by the display of power. The leader glared at, "You would side with them over your own people." "I side with peace," she replied sternly. "Your actions endanger us all." Sarah stepped forward, her expression pleading. "Please, let's stop this madness. We can find a way forward together." The rogues hesitated, their resolve crumbling one by one. They lowered their weapons. The leader, seeing his influence waning, let out a roar of frustration. "Fools, you doom us all." He turned and fled into the forest, disappearing among the glowing trees. The remaining rogues looked uncertain, their aggression replaced with confusion, addressed them gently. "You are welcome to join us. Fear has no place here." Cirrus nodded, her eyes reflecting gratitude. "Thank you." Elder, as the night settled, the villagers and former rogues gathered around a communal fire. The tension had given way to cautious optimism. Conversations flowed, bridges slowly being built. Nate sat beside Lion, exhaustion catching up with him. "That was intense," he said. She smiled softly. "You were willing to sacrifice yourself." He met her gaze. "I couldn't let them hurt you or the child. I realize now that running away doesn't protect anyone." Len placed a hand over his. "You've changed since you first arrived. D maybe facing my past helped me see what's important," he admitted. Kith approached, his expression warm. "You showed great courage today, Nathaniel. Your actions may have prevented a greater conflict." "I just did what I thought was right," Nate replied modestly. "Sometimes that's all it takes." "Sci-Fi said." He looked out over the gathering. "There is still much healing to be done, but tonight was a step forward." Ward Nate glanced at the mingling villagers and rogues. "Do you think the leader will return?" C's gaze grew distant. "Fearful hearts rarely rest. He may return, but we will be ready, not with weapons, but with understanding." Loren leaned into Nate. "And we won't face it alone." He wrapped an arm around her, a sense of belonging settling over him. For the first time in a long while he felt at peace. Later that night, as the village quieted, Nate wandered to the edge of the crystalline forest. The trees glowed softly, their light reflecting the tranquil mood. Saris approached him, her expression contemplative. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for what Nate asked for." Challenge. The twin sons of Zira crept over the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the village. The crystalline spires glimmered like dew-kissed glass, their glow steady for the first time in days. Nate stood at the edge of the valley, watching the sunrise. The quiet hum of the planet surrounded him, a living reminder of the fragile harmony he and Lyran had fought to protect. The events of the previous night lingered in his mind. The rogue faction's attack had left the village scared but unbroken. The leader retreat into the forest had brought a temporary reprieve. But Nate knew it was far from over for now, though there was peace, and he intended to savor it. "You're up early," Lion said, her voice soft. Nate turned to find her standing behind him, her translucent skin catching the light like a shard of blue crystal. She carried herself with quiet strength, though the shadows under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Too much to think about." She stepped beside him, gazing out at the glowing forest. "What's on your mind?" "Everything," he said with a smile. "The rogues, the child, this whole prophecy thing. I keep wondering if I'm ready for any of it." Lion tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. "No one is ever truly ready for change, Nathaniel, but readiness isn't what matters, it's what you choose to do with the moment that counts." He nodded, her words settling over him like a comforting weight. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked. She hesitated, her expression darkening. "Theos won't give up easily. He's too consumed by fear to see reason, but we've planted seeds of doubt among his followers that could buy us time." Nate took a deep breath. "Then we add that time to prepare." Lyran smiled faintly, her hand brushing his. Spoken like a true protector. The village buzzed with quiet activity as the day wore on. The Tsiron villagers worked side by side with the defected rogues, repairing damaged structures and reinforcing their defenses. The scene was surreal, a mix of glowing red and blue forms moving in harmony, but it filled Nate with a cautious sense of hope. Kay approached, his golden aura brighter than usual. The elder carried himself with the calm authority of someone who had seen centuries of conflict and resolution. "You've brought unity to a divided people," Kai said, his deep voice tinged with approval. Nate shook his head. "It wasn't just me, Len. Saris, you all had a hand in this." C's lips curved into a faint smile. "True, but unity often needs a catalyst. You've given us that." "What happens now?" Nate asked. "Now we heal," Kai said, "but healing is not the same as forgetting. The threat remains. Philos will test our resolve again, and we'll be ready." Lurin said, joining them. Inclined his head. "Indeed, but there is another matter to attend to." Lion tensed, her glow flickering. "The child?" Kay nodded. "The time is near, is it not?" She placed a hand over her abdomen, her expression softening. "Soon." Nate glanced between them, a wave of protectiveness surging through him. "Is there anything I should be doing?" C chuckled lightly. "Be present, Nathaniel. That is all that is required. As night fell, the village gathered around the central fire. The air buzzed with an undercurrent of anticipation, though the mood was light. Conversations flowed, laughter mingling with the steady hum of the spires. For the first time, the village felt whole. Nate sat beside Lion, his hand resting lightly on hers. "You know," he said, "I never imagined I'd end up here, part of all this." She arched a brow, and now he looked around at the glowing forms, the shared warmth of a community he had once felt alien to. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Her smile was soft but radiant. "You've changed, Nathaniel." "So have you," he replied. Before she could respond, her expression shifted. Her hand tightened on his, and a faint gasp escaped her lips. Nate stiffened, alarm flashing through him. "What's wrong?" She exhaled slowly, her glow brightening. "The child. It's time." The birthing chamber was a serene space, carved into the largest crystalline spire. Its walls pulsed with a soothing rhythm, casting soft light that filled the room with warmth. Len lay on a raised platform, her breathing steady but labored. Kay stood at her side, his golden glow a calming presence. Nate paced near the entrance, his hands clenching and unclenching. He had faced hostile rogues, entered the Vale of Echoes, and fought for his life. But this moment filled him with a different kind of fear, a fear of the unknown, of the fragile line between life and loss. She glanced at him. "Nathaniel, come here." Nate hesitated before stepping closer. "What can I do?" Smiled faintly. "Be here. That is enough." He nodded, moving to Len's side. She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You're doing great," he said, his voice shaky but earnest. Her eyes met his, a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "You have no idea." Time seemed to blur the room, filled with the hum of the spire, Lion's breaths, and the quiet guidance of sea. Then, as if the world itself held its breath, the light in the room intensified. A cry pierced the air, sharp, clear, and impossibly pure. Nate felt his heart lurch as he looked down to see the child cradled in Kai's arm. The baby's skin glowed faintly, a mixture of blue and gold, and its tiny veins shimmered with a light that seemed to hold the promise of something extraordinary. Kai smiled as he placed the child in Lon's arms, a bridge between worlds. Lion gazed down at the baby, her expression awash with love and awe. "Our child," she whispered. Nate leaned closer, his breath catching as the baby opened its eyes. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, a swirling mix of colors, like the essence of Zera itself. He felt an overwhelming sense of connection, of purpose. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Len asked, her smile widening. "How do you know?" He chuckled softly. "Call it a feeling." The days that followed were a whirlwind of celebration and preparation. The child, named Era, became a symbol of unity, her existence sparking hope among the villagers and defected rogues alike. Nate found himself falling into a new rhythm, one that revolved around protecting and nurturing the fragile peace they had built. But there were challenges ahead. Fellows remained a shadow on the horizon, his presence a reminder that not all would accept change. Nate knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the valley, Nate sat with Len on the edge of the village, a lay nestled between them, her soft glow a gentle reminder of the world they were building. "You think she'll be safe here?" Nate asked. Len leaned against him, her gaze steady. "As long as we stand together." "Yes." He looked down at Aa, a smile tugging at his lips. "She's going to change everything, isn't she?" Lion nodded. "She already has." As the night enveloped them, Nate felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He had come to Zera to escape his past, but instead he had found a future worth fighting for.